February 19, 1945. The black sand beaches of Iwo Jima trembled beneath the thunder of naval bombardment as thousands of United States Marines prepared to storm what military planners called the most heavily fortified 8 square miles on Earth. But what awaited them beneath the volcanic rock was something far more terrifying than anyone had anticipated. A fortress that had transformed an entire island into a weapon. The story of Iwo Jima's defenses began 3 years earlier, when Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kurabayashi arrived on the sulphurous island with orders that would rewrite the rulebook of defensive warfare. A career officer who had studied in the United States and understood American military doctrine better than most of his peers, Kurabayashi looked at the pork-chop-shaped island and saw not just another outpost, but Japan's last opportunity to inflict such devastating casualties that America might reconsider its march toward the Japanese homeland. According to the United States Marine Corps' historical division's detailed accounts of the battle, Kurabayashi commanded over 21,000 troops and transformed Iwo Jima into what he called his underground fortress. The general abandoned traditional Japanese defensive tactics, the suicidal banzai charges and exposed beach defenses that had failed elsewhere. Instead, he ordered his men to burrow into the volcanic rock like earthworms, creating a subterranean maze that would turn the island itself into a living, breathing monster of concrete and steel. The construction was nothing short of extraordinary. Engineers carved 16 miles of tunnels through solid rock, some reaching depths of 90 feet below the surface. They created command centers 40 feet underground, complete with electrical lighting, ventilation systems, and multiple escape routes. Storage rooms held mountains of ammunition and supplies designed to sustain defenders for months. Medical stations were equipped to handle hundreds of casualties. The Japanese military had essentially built an underground city designed for one purpose: to kill as many Americans as possible. But Kurabayashi's genius lay not in the tunnels themselves, but in how they connected to the surface. Artillery pieces and machine gun positions were carefully concealed in reinforced caves and pillboxes, many with multiple firing angles and interconnected by the tunnel network. A gun crew could fire from one position, disappear underground, and emerge minutes later hundreds of yards away to fire again. Concrete bunkers were reinforced with steel plates salvaged from sunken ships. Some positions had walls 6 feet thick, capable of withstanding direct hits from naval artillery. The tunnels weren't just defensive positions, they were strategic chess moves. Kurabayashi positioned his forces to create interlocking fields of fire that covered every approach, every beach, every potential landing zone. He placed observers at Mount Suribachi, the island's highest point, giving his forces eyes across the entire battlefield. Mortar teams could rain death from positions the Americans couldn't even see, adjusting their aim through the elaborate communication system that snaked through the underground passages. What made this fortress truly revolutionary was Kurabayashi's operational philosophy. He ordered his men to hold their fire during the initial landing, to let the Marines establish a beachhead, to draw them deeper into his carefully prepared killing zones. Only then would the island reveal its teeth. Only then would the trap be sprung. November 24, 1944. In a conference room in Pearl Harbor, United States military planners studied reconnaissance photographs of Iwo Jima with growing concern. They could see the obvious defenses, the concrete pillboxes, the coastal gun emplacements, the anti-aircraft batteries surrounding the airfields. What they couldn't see, what no amount of aerial photography could reveal, was the nightmare waiting beneath the surface. The American strategic calculations seemed straightforward enough. Iwo Jima sat roughly halfway between the Mariana Islands, where American B-29 bombers were based, and Tokyo, their ultimate target. Japanese fighters based on Iwo Jima's airfield's harassed bombing missions and provided early warning to the homeland. But more importantly, capturing the island would give damaged B-29s an emergency landing site and provide fighter escorts the range to accompany bombers all the way to Japan. The mathematics of war declared that Iwo Jima must be taken. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, understood the island's formidable defenses but believed that overwhelming firepower would crack even the strongest fortress. Naval planners designed the most intensive pre-invasion bombardment in Pacific War history. For 74 consecutive days, American aircraft pounded the island. B-24 Liberators dropped thousands of tons of bombs on known defensive positions. Then, beginning February 16, 1945, a fleet of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers opened up with their naval guns in what was supposed to be a 3-day pulverizing bombardment. According to research documented by the Naval History and Heritage Command, the Americans fired over 22,000 shells at Iwo Jima during those 3 days. Battleship commanders watched their 16-inch guns hurl massive projectiles at the volcanic rock. Explosions walked across the landscape like the footsteps of angry gods. Smoke and dust rose thousands of feet into the air. From the ships, the island appeared to be disintegrating beneath the onslaught. But appearance and reality diverged dramatically. The naval commanders couldn't realize that they were essentially shooting at shadows. The surface installations they could see and target were often dummies or sacrificial positions. The real fortress lay deeper, protected by layers of volcanic rock that absorbed explosions like a sponge soaking up water. Kurabayashi had anticipated this exact scenario. He'd ordered his men to remain underground during bombardments, to endure the thunder and fury, to trust in the mountain itself to shield them. The Marine commanders requesting the bombardment wanted 10 days to systematically destroy every known defensive position. They understood that Iwo Jima represented something different, something more dangerous than previous island assaults. But the Navy, constrained by operational schedules and the need to support other campaigns, granted only 3 days. This decision would cost thousands of American lives. Major General Harry Schmidt, commanding the 5th Amphibious Corps, expressed his concerns in staff meetings. Intelligence reports suggested Japanese troop strength might be higher than estimated. The volcanic terrain offered natural defensive advantages. The lack of beaches and the steep terraces leading inland from the landing zones created natural choke points. But operational momentum and strategic necessity overrode caution. The invasion would proceed on February 19th. What the Americans were attempting was the military equivalent of knocking down a fortress by shooting at its front door. The traditional approach to island warfare, massive bombardment, followed by amphibious assault, assumed that defenders would position themselves where they could be targeted and destroyed from a distance, but Kurabayashi had rewritten the rules. He'd created a fortress that couldn't be destroyed from the outside because it didn't really exist on the outside. The true fortress was invisible, buried beneath rock and sand, waiting patiently for its enemy to come within reach. The American plan called for a swift, decisive victory. Marines would land on the southeast beaches, capture the southern portion of the island including Mount Suribachi within days, then sweep northward to secure the airfields and eliminate remaining resistance. Total estimated time, 5 days. Total estimated casualties, lighter than previous campaigns because the extensive bombardment would have destroyed most defensive positions. February 19, 1945, 0900 hours. The first wave of Marines from the 4th and 5th Divisions hit the beaches of Iwo Jima aboard tracked landing vehicles called antrax. The men expected the hell of immediate defensive fire, the machine guns raking the boats, the mortar exploding in the surf, the desperate struggle to reach cover. Instead, they found something far more unnerving: silence. The antrax crawled out of the water onto beaches composed of volcanic ash so fine and loose that men sank to their ankles with every step. Equipment bogged down immediately. Vehicles struggled to find traction in the black sand that absorbed weight like quicksand. The Marines advanced inland toward the first terrace, a steep rise 15 feet high that marked the beginning of Iwo Jima's interior. They could see the bare slopes of Mount Suribachi looming to their left. They could see the smoking remnants of the naval bombardment, but they saw no Japanese. For nearly 40 minutes, the landing proceeded almost unopposed. Wave after wave of Marines poured onto the beaches, creating the exact concentration of forces that military doctrine warned against. 8 battalions, thousands of men crowded onto less than a mile of shoreline, struggling through the treacherous sand, climbing the terraces, moving equipment forward. The silence felt wrong, felt dangerous, but there was no choice except to continue pushing inland. Then Kurabayashi sprung his trap. According to detailed accounts compiled by Marine Corps combat historians who interviewed survivors, the island seemed to explode all at once. Artillery shells began falling with devastating accuracy, targeting the crowded beaches where men and equipment were packed densest. Machine guns opened fire from positions the Marines couldn't even see, firing ports cleverly concealed in rocky outcrops. Weapons zeroed in on predetermined killing zones. Mortar rained down from Mount Suribachi and the high ground to the north, their crews protected in reinforced caves, firing and then retreating into the tunnel system before counter-battery fire could reach them. The Marines found themselves trapped in a killing field engineered with diabolical precision. Every foot of beach was covered by interlocking fields of fire. Advancing meant running into machine gun positions that seemed to materialize from the ground itself. Retreating meant exposing themselves to artillery and mortar that had already calculated the range to every square yard of the landing zone. Men dove for cover that didn't exist, tried to dig foxholes in volcanic ash that collapsed as quickly as they could shovel it, called for support from tanks and artillery that couldn't move through the impossible terrain. The black sand that had seemed merely inconvenient now became a death trap. Vehicles stalled and created bottlenecks. Supply chains collapsed as equipment piled up on the beaches. Medical corpsmen worked frantically to reach wounded Marines while mortar rounds exploded around them. The carefully planned assault devolved into chaos within minutes. Battalion commanders lost contact with company commanders. Company commanders lost contact with platoon leaders. Individual Marines found themselves fighting blind, shooting at muzzle flashes and hoping they were hitting something, but the Marines kept coming. Despite casualties that would have broken most fighting forces, despite terrain that seemed designed by a malevolent god to prevent military operations, despite facing an enemy they couldn't see fighting from positions they couldn't locate, the Marines pushed forward. They advanced by yards, by feet, by inches. They destroyed pillboxes with flamethrowers and satchel charges only to discover those positions connected to tunnels that led to 3 more pillboxes. They called in naval gunfire that pulverized surface positions while the Japanese defenders simply moved through their underground highways to new firing positions. By nightfall of the first day, the Marines had established a tenuous beachhead roughly 3,000 yards wide and several hundred yards deep. The cost was staggering, over 500 killed and nearly 2,000 wounded. The planned swift advance had barely scratched the surface of Iwo Jima's defenses. Medical stations overflowed with casualties. Ammunition supplies ran dangerously low, and ahead of them stretched the rest of the island's 7 more square miles of volcanic rock honeycombed with tunnels and packed with defenders who had proven willing to die to exact maximum American casualties. The fortress had revealed itself, and it was more formidable than anyone had imagined. February 23, 1945. After 4 days of the most savage close-quarters fighting the Pacific War had yet witnessed, 40 Marines from Easy Company 2nd Battalion, 28th Regiment reached the summit of Mount Suribachi and raised an American flag on a length of pipe. The moment, captured by photographer Joe Rosenthal in what would become the most famous image of World War II, suggested victory was at hand. It was an illusion. Mount Suribachi, the volcanic cone dominating the southern end of Iwo Jima, represented only 1/10 of the island's total area. The Japanese had transformed the 550-foot mountain into a fortress within the fortress, honeycombing its interior with artillery positions, observation posts, and defensive emplacements connected by 7 levels of tunnels. Marines attacking the mountain faced machine gun fire from positions that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. Every cave entrance led to a network of passages that allowed defenders to retreat, reposition, and emerge from different locations. The assault on Suribachi required 4 days because conventional military tactics simply didn't work against an enemy that could disappear underground. Marines would assault a cave entrance, fight their way inside, clear what they thought was the position, only to have Japanese soldiers emerge behind them from passages they hadn't discovered. Flamethrower teams became invaluable, pumping burning fuel deep into cave systems. Combat engineers sealed positions with demolition charges, entombing defenders who refused surrender. The fighting was intimate and horrifying, grenades thrown in darkness, bayonets in confined spaces, the screams of dying men echoing through volcanic rock. Research documented by the United States Army Center of Military History notes that taking Suribachi cost the 28th Regiment over 900 casualties from a regiment that numbered roughly 3,000 men. Every yard of elevation was purchased with American blood. Japanese defenders fought from positions prepared years in advance, positions with multiple escape routes and concealed firing ports that gave them devastating advantages. The Marines prevailed through raw courage and the willingness to accept casualties that would have been unthinkable in any other context. But Suribachi was merely the opening act. The real fortress lay to the north. The northern two-thirds of Iwo Jima presented terrain that seemed designed to kill attackers. Ridges and ravines ran roughly perpendicular to the direction of Marine advance, creating natural defensive barriers every 100 yards. Each ridge was fortified with concrete pillboxes, reinforced caves, and concealed artillery positions. Each ravine became a killing ground where Marines were exposed to fire from three sides. The volcanic rock absorbed artillery shells without shattering, creating shrapnel-free zones where explosions looked devastating but caused minimal damage to underground positions. Kurebayashi had positioned his strongest defenses in the north, protecting the ridgelines that overlooked the central plateau and the island's two airfields. Places that would become infamous in Marine Corps' history: the Meat Grinder, Turkey Knob, the amphitheater, Hill 362 were fortified complexes where every position connected to the tunnel network, where fields of fire overlapped with mathematical precision, where Japanese soldiers could emerge from spider holes to attack from unexpected angles. The Marines adapted their tactics through bitter experience. They learned to never approach caves head-on, to always assume tunnels connected to other positions, to use demolitions and flamethrowers rather than small arms when clearing fortifications. They developed combined arms tactics where tanks worked in concert with infantry, where flamethrower teams and demolition experts became as crucial as riflemen. They learned that taking a position meant nothing if you didn't seal it completely, otherwise defenders would simply return through the tunnels after you passed. The fortress wasn't just physical defenses, it was a psychological weapon. Marines advancing across open ground never knew where the next burst of machine gun fire would come from. Artillery observers hidden in the ridgelines called down precise barrages on American positions. Snipers fired from concealed positions and then vanished into the tunnel network before counterfire arrived. The stress of fighting an invisible enemy in hellish terrain broke even hardened veterans. Combat fatigue casualties mounted alongside physical wounds. Yet the Marines continued advancing. Units that had been decimated in the first days were reconstituted and thrown back into combat. Replacements arrived from the ships offshore and were fed directly into frontline positions. Artillery batteries fired tens of thousands of rounds at identified targets. Naval gunfire turned ridgelines into moonscapes. Airstrikes dropped napalm on defensive positions. The Americans brought overwhelming firepower to bear, but the fortress absorbed the punishment and continued fighting. The strategic irony was profound. The United States military possessed enormous technological and material advantages, yet these advantages meant relatively little against an enemy that had gone underground. You couldn't bomb what you couldn't see. Artillery couldn't destroy positions protected by dozens of feet of rock. Naval gunfire couldn't reach tunnels. The war had devolved into the most primitive form of combat: small groups of men fighting over yards of ground, clearing caves and bunkers one by one. March 2nd, 1945. While Marines fought for every blood-soaked yard of volcanic rock, a different kind of victory was already unfolding. On Airfield No. 1, the Navy's construction, battalions were filling shell craters and repairing runways even as artillery rounds still fell on the southern portions of the field. Within days of the initial landing, damaged B-29 bombers were making emergency landings on Iwo Jima, their crews saved by the very runway Japanese defenders could still see from their fortified positions in the ridgelines. This was the profound strategic paradox at the heart of Iwo Jima. The Japanese had built an invincible fortress, but the Americans weren't really trying to conquer the fortress. They were ignoring it. Kurebayashi had created a defensive masterpiece designed to inflict maximum casualties and delay American advances as long as possible. His tunnel network, his interlocking fields of fire, his strategy of defense in depth, all of it was engineered to make capturing the island so costly that American planners might reconsider their march toward Japan. He'd succeeded brilliantly in the tactical sense. American casualties were mounting at rates unseen in previous Pacific campaigns, but he'd fundamentally misunderstood the American strategic objective. The United States didn't need to kill every Japanese defender. They didn't need to clear every tunnel or destroy every fortified position. They needed the airfields. Once Marines secured enough of the island to protect those airfields from Japanese artillery, once Seabees could repair and operate the runways, the strategic objective was essentially achieved. Everything else was simply finishing work. This represented a revolutionary approach to warfare that the Japanese military doctrine couldn't quite comprehend. Traditional military thinking held that you defeated an enemy force by destroying it, by overwhelming its defenses, by achieving total victory. But American industrial and logistical superiority allowed for a different calculus. The United States could afford to accept higher casualties in exchange for faster strategic gains. They could bypass and contain enemy strongpoints rather than reducing them through direct assault. They could achieve their objectives even while the fortress remained partially intact. According to strategic analyses conducted by military historians at the United States Naval War College after the war, the decision to proceed with the Iwo Jima invasion, despite understanding the defensive challenges, represented a clear-eyed assessment of acceptable costs versus strategic benefits. Every B-29 that landed safely on Iwo Jima represented 11 crew members saved. Every fighter escort mission that launched from the island increased bombing accuracy and reduced losses over Japan. The airfields were worth the price in American blood, however terrible that price proved to be. The Japanese strategy, by contrast, was ultimately self-defeating. By building an invincible fortress and committing every defender to fight to the death, Kurebayashi guaranteed that his forces would be fixed in place, unable to maneuver, unable to threaten American operations elsewhere. The fortress became a tomb of his own design. The tunnel network that protected his soldiers also trapped them. The strategy of defense in depth meant that once bypassed, positions couldn't be reinforced or resupplied. The Americans could simply contain and reduce these positions at their leisure while continuing to operate the airfields. By early March, this strategic dynamic had become obvious. The first operational B-29 missions were using Iwo Jima as an emergency landing field. P-51 Mustang fighters were being stationed on the island to provide escort for bombing missions over Japan. The Seabees had repaired and expanded the runways, built fuel storage facilities, and established the infrastructure necessary for sustained air operations. Japanese defenders still controlled portions of the northern island and continued fighting from their fortified positions, but they could no longer threaten these operations. The Marines continued their grinding advance northward, clearing defensive positions with flamethrowers and demolitions, sealing caves and bunkers, reducing the fortress piece by piece. But the urgency had diminished. The island was already serving its strategic purpose. The fortress that was supposed to be invincible was being rendered irrelevant even as it continued to resist. Kurebayashi understood what was happening. In messages sent to Imperial headquarters before communications were cut, he reported that American engineers were operating the airfields while his forces still held defensive positions. He described watching B-29s land and take off while he remained unable to strike at them effectively. The fortress had become a spectator to its own strategic obsolescence. This wasn't the first time in military history that seemingly invincible defenses had been circumvented rather than conquered. But it represented a new sophistication in American operational thinking, a willingness to accept that total tactical victory wasn't necessary if strategic objectives could be achieved through other means. The Marines would continue fighting and dying to eliminate the Japanese garrison. But this was as much about ensuring future security and establishing precedent as about immediate military necessity. The fortress was invincible. The Americans just ignored it, and in doing so, they won. March 9, 1945. After 18 days of combat, the 5th Marine Division reached the northern coastline of Iwo Jima, officially cutting the island in half and isolating Japanese defenders into pockets. The fortress hadn't fallen, it had been dissected. What remained were islands within an island, fortified zones still connected by tunnels, still defended by soldiers who had no intention of surrendering, but no longer capable of coordinated defense or strategic impact. The cost of this achievement was staggering beyond anything American military planners had anticipated. By the time organized Japanese resistance collapsed on March 26, the United States Marine Corps had suffered nearly 26,000 casualties, 6,821 killed in action, and nearly 20,000 wounded. These numbers represented roughly one-third of the entire Marine force committed to the battle. Some individual units suffered casualty rates exceeding 75%. Every battalion commander who landed on February 19th was either killed or wounded. The casualty figures revealed the unique horror of fighting against Kuribayashi's fortress. In previous Pacific campaigns, Japanese defensive tactics, the emphasis on beach defenses and banzai charges, resulted in high initial casualties, followed by steady reduction of enemy forces. Iwo Jima inverted this pattern. Casualties remained consistently high throughout the campaign because every defensive position required direct assault. There were no shortcuts, no clever flanking maneuvers, no way to avoid the grinding work of clearing fortified positions one by one. Medical personnel performed miracles under impossible conditions. Corpsmen crawled through fire to reach wounded Marines. Battalion aid stations operated within artillery range of Japanese positions. Hospital ships offshore handled a constant flow of casualties that strained their capacity. The nature of wounds reflected the close-quarters fighting blast injuries from grenades and mortar, burns from flamethrowers, gunshot wounds from firefights measured in yards rather than hundreds of yards. Japanese casualties were even more catastrophic. Of the approximately 21,000 defenders Kuribayashi commanded, only 216 were captured alive, most of them too badly wounded to commit suicide. The rest died in the tunnels and caves, buried under collapsed positions, sealed in by demolition charges, consumed by flamethrowers, or killed in the final desperate counterattacks that marked the end of organized resistance. The fortress that was supposed to protect them became their mass grave. Kuribayashi himself disappeared during the final days of the battle. Multiple accounts suggest he led a final attack somewhere in the northern part of the island, but his body was never definitively identified. The commander who had promised to fight to the last man and defend Iwo Jima to the death apparently kept his word. The fortress claimed its architect along with everyone else. But numbers alone don't capture the human cost. Every casualty represented a family receiving a telegram, a community mourning a loss, a life cut short or permanently altered. The wounded Marines who survived faced years of recovery, many carrying shrapnel fragments that couldn't be removed, suffering from burns that required multiple surgeries, bearing psychological scars that 1940s medicine barely understood and couldn't effectively treat. The American public, reading newspaper accounts of the battle while watching the famous flag-raising photograph become iconic, struggled to reconcile the image of victory with the staggering casualty lists. Political pressure mounted as the full cost of taking Iwo Jima became clear. Military leaders found themselves defending the decision to assault the island, arguing that strategic benefits justified the losses. The debate would continue for decades. Was Iwo Jima worth the price? From a purely strategic standpoint, the answer was yes. By war's end, more than 2,400 B-29 bombers made emergency landings on Iwo Jima, representing approximately 27,000 aircrew members saved. Fighter escorts flying from the island significantly improved bombing accuracy and reduced bomber losses over Japan. The psychological impact on Japanese defenders seeing American bombers operating from an island that was supposed to be an invincible fortress was immeasurable. The capture of Iwo Jima shortened the Pacific War by demonstrating that no Japanese defensive position was secure. But strategic calculus feels obscene when measured against individual tragedy. Each of those 6,821 killed Marines had a name, a story, a life that mattered beyond operational analyses and casualty statistics. The fortress extracted its price not just in lives lost but in futures erased, the children never born, the achievements never accomplished, the ordinary human experiences never lived. For the Japanese defenders, the cost was total annihilation. Kuribayashi's strategy of fighting to the death meant that his fortress became a sealed vault, a place where 20,000 men went to die with virtually no possibility of survival. Unlike other campaigns where soldiers could retreat or surrender, the defenders of Iwo Jima were committed to remain until death claimed them. The fortress wasn't just invincible from the outside, it was inescapable from within. April 17, 1945. Less than a month after the flag-raising ceremony officially declaring Iwo Jima secure, military analysts from all branches of the United States Armed Forces descended on the island to study what had happened. They walked through the tunnel networks, examined the fortified positions, interviewed survivors, and compiled detailed reports on Japanese defensive tactics and American assault techniques. The fortress, even in defeat, had lessons to teach. The most profound lesson was that defensive engineering had evolved faster than assault tactics. Traditional amphibious doctrine bombardment, landing, advance assumed that firepower could neutralize prepared defenses. Iwo Jima demonstrated this assumption was dangerously outdated. No amount of naval gunfire or aerial bombardment could destroy an enemy that lived underground. Future operations would require new approaches, specialized weapons for bunker warfare, better intelligence gathering to identify tunnel networks, tactics that emphasized containment and isolation rather than direct frontal assault. The Marine Corps studied Kuribayashi's defensive philosophy and recognized its sophistication. His abandonment of beach defenses, his emphasis on letting attackers establish a beachhead before engaging, his use of reverse slope defenses and interconnected positions, all of it represented advanced military thinking that contradicted traditional Japanese tactical doctrine. Staff officers noted that Kuribayashi had essentially invented modern defensive warfare, fortifications designed not to hold territory but to inflict maximum casualties, defense in depth with no expectation of reinforcement or relief, complete commitment to a war of attrition. These lessons informed planning for Operation Downfall, the proposed invasion of Japan's home islands scheduled for November 1945. Military planners anticipated that Japanese defenders would employ the Iwo Jima model on a massive scale, tunnel networks in the mountains, fortified positions covering every beach and approaches, a garrison willing to fight to total annihilation. Casualty estimates for downfall reflected this assumption, projecting hundreds of thousands of American deaths and millions of Japanese casualties. The fortress of Iwo Jima, multiplied across Kyushu and Honshu, promised carnage beyond comprehension. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 made Operation Downfall unnecessary. Japan surrendered without invasion, and American forces occupied the home islands peacefully. Historians still debate whether the decision to use atomic weapons was justified, but the specter of Iwo Jima inevitably shadows those debates. Would American political will have sustained an invasion promising Iwo Jima-level casualties week after week, month after month? Could democratic nations prosecute wars of that scale and brutality indefinitely? For the Marines who survived Iwo Jima, the lessons were more personal and immediate. They'd learned that courage alone wasn't sufficient against prepared defenses, that technological superiority meant nothing against an enemy willing to die in place. That victory could be achieved even at costs that seemed unbearable. Many struggled with survivors' guilt, the question of why they lived when so many didn't, whether anything could justify the losses they'd witnessed. These psychological wounds proved as enduring as physical injuries. The fortress also taught lessons about the limits of military doctrine and the danger of preparing for the last war rather than the next one. Japanese strategic thinking emphasized honor, sacrifice, and defense of every inch of territory. This doctrine led directly to the Iwo Jima strategy, build an invincible fortress, and force the enemy to pay an unacceptable price for worthless volcanic rock. But American strategic flexibility, the willingness to accept high costs for valuable strategic gains, the ability to bypass and ignore the invincible fortress while achieving operational objectives rendered that doctrine obsolete. In the decades following World War II, military theorists studied Iwo Jima as a case study in both defensive excellence and strategic failure. Kuribayashi had built the perfect fortress and implemented a flawless defensive battle. Every tactical decision he made was correct. His forces performed exactly as planned, inflicting maximum casualties while utilizing terrain and fortifications with masterful skill. And yet he lost, because tactical perfection couldn't overcome strategic irrelevance. The Americans achieved their objectives, secure the airfields, project air power toward Japan even, while the fortress remained partially intact. Modern military doctrine reflects these lessons. Special operations forces trained for tunnel warfare. Bunker-busting weapons were developed specifically to address fortified positions. Military planners emphasized maneuver and strategic objectives over direct confrontation with prepared defenses. The fortress of Iwo Jima stands as a monument to the danger of assuming that strong defenses alone can achieve strategic goals. For the Japanese military and nation, Iwo Jima represented something even more devastating. Proof that Bushido valor and willingness to die couldn't overcome material and technological disadvantages. The fortress that was supposed to demonstrate Japanese martial superiority instead revealed the futility of sacrificial defense. Every Japanese soldier who died in those tunnels, all 20,000 of them, died without changing the war's outcome. The fortress guaranteed their deaths without guaranteeing strategic impact. The lessons written in the volcanic rock of Iwo Jima remain relevant 8 decades later. They speak to the relationship between tactics and strategy, the limits of defensive warfare, the importance of strategic flexibility, and the terrible human cost of conflict. Today, November 28, 2025, 80 years after the battle's conclusion, Iwo Jima remains an active Japanese military facility, closed to general tourism but open to veteran pilgrimages and official commemorations. The tunnels remain largely intact beneath the volcanic rock, a tomb containing the remains of thousands of Japanese soldiers whose bodies were never recovered. The island stands as both memorial and warning, a reminder of what humans can achieve through engineering and courage, and what they destroy through war. The fortress of Iwo Jima changed military thinking in ways that extended far beyond World War II. During the Korean War, Chinese forces employed similar tunnel tactics in the hills north of the 38th parallel, creating defensive positions that proved nearly impossible to assault directly. American forces, remembering Iwo Jima, adapted their tactics accordingly, bypassing strongpoints when possible, using massive firepower when direct assault was necessary, accepting stalemate rather than pursuing Pyrrhic victories. Vietnam presented another iteration of the fortress concept. The Viet Cong Co Chi tunnels and the elaborate defensive networks throughout South Vietnam echoed Kuribayashi's philosophy: let enemies establish presence on the surface while the real war is fought from underground. American forces struggled with these tactics just as they had struggled on Iwo Jima, learning once again that technological superiority provides limited advantages against determined defenders fighting from prepared positions with nothing to lose. Modern military conflicts continue wrestling with the fortress problem. The tunnel networks beneath Gaza represent a 21st century evolution of Kuribayashi's concept's defensive infrastructure built over decades, interconnected positions that allow fighters to appear and disappear, strategic depth that renders bombardment ineffective. The technological sophistication has increased ventilation systems, electrical power, communication networks, but the fundamental concept remains: go underground, connect everything, make the fortress invisible and ubiquitous. The human legacy of Iwo Jima proves even more enduring than the military lessons. The battle produced 27 Medals of Honor, more than any other single engagement in American military history. 22 of these were awarded posthumously, reflecting the extraordinary sacrifices required to overcome the fortress's defenses. The names of the recipients: John Basilone, Douglas Jacobson, Jack Lummis, and so many others remain honored in Marine Corps lore. The famous flag-raising photograph by Joe Rosenthal became the model for the Marine Corps War Memorial in Arlington, Virginia. The bronze statue of 6 men raising the flag atop Mount Suribachi stands as perhaps America's most recognized military monument. Millions of visitors annually see the image without necessarily understanding the context that 3 of the 6 men in the photograph were killed before the battle ended, that the flag raising occurred only 4 days into a 36-day campaign, that the mountain beneath their feet was honeycombed with tunnels containing defenders who would fight for weeks after that banner was raised. For Japan, Iwo Jima became a symbol of sacrifice and tragedy rather than military virtue. Post-war Japanese society struggled to reconcile the courage of the defenders with the futility of their mission. Kurobayashi himself became a tragic figure, a general who understood his enemy, who fought brilliantly, who demanded maximum effort from his soldiers, yet who led them all to pointless deaths in service of a war that was already lost. His letters to his family, discovered after the war, revealed a man who understood the likely outcome but fulfilled his duty anyway.